Hello and welcome to this first in a series of online talks featuring speakers from the London Speaker Bureau. My name is Graham Brown-Martin. I'm an author, broadcaster and catalyst bringing strategic insight and leadership coaching to businesses and governments who are establishing cultures of innovation across how we work, live and learn. I'm also joined in the background by Alexi and Ludovine from the London Speaker Bureau who are managing the technical support for this webinar. If you're having any difficulty, please tap the hands up button down below there and they will come to your rescue via the online chat feature. Your audio and video is muted for other participants' convenience and comfort. As you'll know, the London Speaker Bureau is a global resource for corporations and governments, providing keynote speakers, executive learning masterclasses, boardroom advisors, and of course, webinars like today. These webinars will help us stay connected during these unprecedented times, hearing from the influential business leaders, experts, and politicians that the London Speaker Bureau represent. These are, of course, challenging and potentially transformative times. I hope that you are all keeping well and safe, whilst having the opportunity to reflect on how our world, our society, and our economy may change as a result of this crisis, and how you might help in facilitating the vital conversations that are needed to take us all forward. Will this be a catalyst for renewal and reinvention, to consider how we may innovate and do things differently? Over the coming weeks, these webinars will seek to provide some intellectual nourishment, insight, and informed optimism to these reflections. And today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Mark Stevenson to ask the question, will COVID-19 cause the world to rethink itself? Describing himself as a reluctant futurist and a possibilist, Mark Stevenson is the author of 2 best-selling books, An Optimist Tour of the Future and the award-winning We Do Things Differently. He is one of the world's most respected thinkers on the interplay of technology and society, helping a diverse mix of clients that include government agencies, NGOs, corporates, and arts organizations to become future literate and adapt their cultures and strategies to squarely face the questions the future is asking them. He's also an occasional comedy writer with work performed on Radio 4. His first play, The Fast Octopus Soup, toured the UK in the spring of last year. He also is one half of the Futurenauts. Mark, who are the Futurenauts? And what is a possibilist?
The Futurenauts are me, Ed Gillespie, and the British comedian John Richardson. And we're launching a series to try and talk about big systemic change that's kind of accessible to the sort of general public. So a lot of humor, but talking about big issues. So it's one of my attempts to hack culture. And a possibilist is somebody who believes the future could be better, but doesn't necessarily think it will be. It depends on what we do.
So, with that in mind, in light of the current crisis, what question is the future asking us, and how will we answer? It comes back to the original statement: as will COVID-19 cause the world to rethink itself? Over to you, Mark.
Well, I think we should think of coronavirus as a fairly easy training day for what's coming next, unless we use the opportunity to think differently, because I guess right now, all the assumptions that the world is operating under have been roundly challenged, and a lot of them found to be staggeringly inaccurate. There's a great quote by Philip K. Dick, the author who wrote the book that became Blade Runner most famously. And he said, reality is that when you stop believing in it, it doesn't go away. And we've suddenly found ourselves with what reality really is. But this is really just the beginning, I think, because coronavirus has kind of brought into sharp relief a lot of the underlying problems that we need to solve as society, whether that's in healthcare, whether it's problems with governance, and indeed the social contract. There's not just me saying that. I mean, the FT this week, its editorial leader was virus lays bare the frailty of the social contract. And if you read the FT's editorial, you might have thought you were reading the Morning Star, quite frankly. It was talking about how we needed to invest more in healthcare and social services and see them as investments, not as some kind of burden on the state. My friend Ed Gillespie says that, when the rickety house burns down, what you don't want to do is go and rebuild the rickety house as it was. You want to go and build something new. And I guess that's the opportunity we have now. Because even before coronavirus hit, we pretty much knew that most things were broken, whether it was the retreat of democracy. We already knew that our healthcare systems were really expensive sick care systems. And now we're finding out what it's like to run a healthcare system with no spare capacity. At the same time, the food system means that, and the way we work, it means that 7 out of 10 of us are obese. And so the market response to that was to make drugs for obesity, which is kind of ridiculous, actually. What we should be doing is thinking about healthcare, having a society that's generally healthy so that the healthcare system isn't overburdened. But right now we've got a system, an interlinked commercial and healthcare system that actually breeds people who are very susceptible to coronavirus, people with diabetes, people who are overweight, people who are stressed. And these are the sort of things that actually, suppress your immune system, make you more susceptible to the virus. Wendell Berry said it quite well. He said, people are fed up with a food industry that pays no attention to health and a health industry that pays no attention to food. And then, of course, we've got the whole climate change issue, which has been brought into sharp relief by the reduction of carbon emissions. But, right now, we're still sitting with public policies from the world governments that lead us to a 3.5 degree warmed world, which is, would make coronavirus look like a walk in the park. Gaylord Nelson expressed this pretty well, the American senator. He said, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not the other way around. And I think we've all learned, in the last month that the economy is also a wholly owned subsidiary of the healthcare system, not the other way around. So the translation for anybody, really, whatever your position is, any investment of your time or your money that doesn't take into account the environment or human health isn't an investment. It's a cost on the future. And yet we've got a system where 1% of the world's population owns 50% of the wealth. And suddenly now using that wealth sensibly to solve this problem becomes a lot harder because a lot of it's being corralled by a very small number of people. And we see sports stars and politicians and royalty get tested for the virus, while frontline workers who are trying to save people's lives can't even get protective equipment. While all that was going on, of course, we've all been sent home from work, which for a lot of people is quite a good thing, because 85% of people don't enjoy their jobs. That's a statistic that comes out all the time, because they've realised that their salary is bribery, not reward. Bribery to be complicit in the system that we already knew was broken, that's actually sort of taking away our children's future. And then remember, of course, if 85% of people don't like their jobs, think of the mental health burden that comes with, which again increases your stress, which makes you more susceptible to the virus. And yet, some of those people, 400,000 of them in one day, decide to volunteer for the NHS. And that proves to me that meaning will always trump bribery every single time. And we need jobs and an economy with more meaning in it. When you think about it, if you work for the average organisation, 85% of the people who work for you don't want to be there. They've all been sent home. Now, half of those people are going to come back desperate for some salary and some companionship and some colleagues. But half of them are going to come back probably questioning pretty much everything that you stand for, having spent 3 months alone with their soul. And the question for most companies is, what are you going to say to them when they come back? What will your answer be? Because now I think is the absolute time for forward-thinking organisations, individuals to shine, to reinvent the world for this kind of post-virus society that we might want. And that is the real game in town. And this could be our best life's work, wherever we are in our careers. Seth Godin has this rather nice quote. He says, increasingly there are 2 types of organisations left, the brave and the dead. And I think that's never been more true than it is now. Andy Grove, who used to run Intel, used to say that bad companies are destroyed by a crisis, good companies survive them, great companies are improved by them. And I think what's true for companies in that quote is actually also true for nations and families and indeed the species. So are we a great species? Are we a great nation? Are you a great company? Are you going to be strengthened by this? Or are we going to reevaluate things? And I think it all comes down really to asking the right questions. And finally now it seems to me, I've been banging on about this for years, the sort of questions that people are now openly asking in things like, FT leaders and the CEOs that I'm working with are suddenly asking all these kind of really important questions about social justice and social contract and the environment and healthcare and all those kind of things. Because the assumptions under which they are working have become very fragile. And now the impossible is possible for the first time. Spain this week has announced it's going to introduce universal basic income, and not just for the virus. They say we're pretty sure that's going to stay afterwards. Max Planck once said that Max Planck once said that science advances one funeral at a time. And it seems to me that public policy and politics doesn't require one funeral; it requires the prospect of millions, and then it might advance. So you use this opportunity right now. And one of the things I've learned from all my writing and work is that what tends to work is bottom-up, diverse, collaborative systems tend to deal with complexity and change better, whether that's urban farming, rebuilding Detroit, whether it's community energy systems, whether it's participatory budgeting, whether it's open source systems of drug discovery, whether it's even blockchain. They're kind of open bottom-up solutions to complex problems. The administrative overhead of doing those things is actually quite a lot, and that's why people don't want to do them, because managing a crowd is quite intensive. But the ROI, if you manage that crowd well and all its diverse inputs, is enormous. And so it's the way I think we're going to move forward. We're rediscovering that sense of connection as a species. We're kind of throwing aside our politics and going, we're all in this together, which is nice. But it's fairly obvious anyway. But one of the things I wonder is, like, why does bottom-up diverse collaboration work? It's not just the diversity of ideas. It's because it's how human beings build trust and how we learn to be happy. You've got this thing called the human trust ladder, where you start sharing stories and then you share information about yourself. When you're happy doing that, you'll share assets, so things of value. When you're happy doing that, you might do a project together. When you're happy doing that, you might start to question the rules of the game. And this works for individuals, it works for family groups, it works for communities, it works for businesses. As you go up that ladder of trust and sharing and collaboration, you also become increasingly socialized and increasingly depoliticized, because people divided by politics are very soon brought together around a project. You ask people to build something, they generally agree on 97% of it. But the socialization is really, really important, because the biggest indicator of whether you live a long and healthy life, and actually one of the biggest indicators of whether you will be susceptible to coronavirus or not, is how socialized you are, how strong your social networks are, because they reduce stress, they give you a safetyness around you, and all the science is in on this. So bottom-up diverse collaboration isn't just the thing that generally works in terms of its mechanics, it's also actually essential for human health and happiness. And that's what the world needs right now. And I think we're all realizing that, we even as we're being asked to separate ourselves, we're being asked to draw together. And, we're about to learn very strongly just how much we need each other, just as we're being asked to stay apart. And the problem with the world, of course, is rather than having this bottom-up, diverse, collaborative system, most of the world is pretty authoritarian. It's top-down, it's top-down, it's siloed fiefdoms of knowledge. Most public policy for the last 40 years has been at the expense of social cohesion and in favor of competition. Most corporations and organizations treat us as kind of atomized consumers to be sold at rather than citizens to be engaged with. The dominant Western narrative is you are an individual first and a citizen second. Most politics is us and them, and that's just been shown not to work anymore. So the bad news is that things were broken anyway before coronavirus. The good news is that it's fixable, and I think actually this will be a forcing house for us to learn some of those skills and ways, skills and techniques in a way that we hadn't necessarily thought about previously. And the ugly news is, even after coronavirus, which is going to go on for 18 months probably, it's going to get very messy as this transition from the old world of sort of economies of scale and hierarchies to economies of distribution and networks, it starts to really gain traction as we move from extractive business models to regenerative ones, as we go from an egocentric world to a much more eco-centric world. That's going to be very messy because the status quo is pretty well funded and it's not going to go easily. But as my friend Juan Enriquez says, he's one of the most important investors in America. He's a peace negotiator. He's regularly voted the best teacher at Harvard Business School, so a pretty smart cookie. And last time I took him out to lunch, he said there's going to be whole nations who end up on the scrap heap because they don't understand this stuff. And so, we're going to get there, I think. And this is kind of like I say, it's a bit of a training day. We've been told for years that the drastic action we need on climate change just can't be done. It's just way too hard. But now governments are turning on a penny in a matter of hours, So we know it wasn't a lack of ability to do this kind of stuff or a lack of vision. It was simply a lack of the right incentives for leadership. Now, the people on this call, a lot of them are working for large organizations. Some of them are in positions of leadership. And so I think we now have a massive incentive to change the world. And I really don't want anybody to squander it, because I think we'll all regret it if we do. We all now got to be very brave, personally and professionally, to make the changes that will create the world that we would all like for our children. And the one thing I will say, asking people to be brave is good, and there's no bravery without fear. And fear is hard. But the one thing I've learned throughout my entire life is that even though fear is hard, regret is an absolute fucker. So now is our time, I think, to start to ask the real questions we've been dying to ask in work, but been told we couldn't because the shareholders didn't want to hear them. Take our full selves into our lives, both at home, at work, and in our communities, and build the world we want. Because I believe we can now, and we've been given almost a kind of an opportunity to test ourselves for the bigger challenges that are coming. Catherine the Great said it quite well. She said, a great wind is blowing that either gives you imagination or a headache. So I think I'll leave it with Catherine, because I think at the moment, we've probably got a bit of both.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that. We're going to start taking some questions. If you'd like, we've got a lot of people in the audience now. If you'd like to ask a question to Mark, please put it in the Q&A box that you have. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you have a number of options there, and there's one that says Q&A. If you could put them in there, we can throw them over to Mark. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, I just want to go back over something you said. I mean, in sort of terms of fiscal stimulus that's being discussed around the planet, you know, about Europe and America and so forth. I mean, fiscal stimulus to maintain the status quo, I mean, it is exceeded the stimulus that went into the 2008 banking crisis by a long way. I mean, sort of picking up your point, you sort of touched on it. I mean, after this crisis, do you think that we'll see a different kind of, for want of a better term, capitalism or post-capitalism emerge? I mean, you mentioned universal basic income, for example, because we are going to see a significant number of people out of work. And I mean, you said about the companies of the future, or the brave or the dead, but there will be some brave companies that will, unfortunately, may be damaged as a consequence of this. What do you see happening in terms of that transition? Because it's going to be messy, but how does that transition, what does that transition look like? And you mentioned a period of 18 months. I wonder, could you just put some flesh on that?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's going to go on for 18 months because we are as vulnerable as a planet as the world healthcare system in the world. So you can close it down in one place and it's going to turn up somewhere else and people travel. Or you stop them traveling, which has a massive effect on the world economy. The amount of stimulus actually that's gone into the US, for instance, pretty much amounts to 1 week's worth of the US economy. They've got unemployment of, I think, 6 million people signed on this week. I mean, we are looking at a global retraction of the economy of 50 to 20% for a considerable period. This is the Great Depression on steroids. Or we reevaluate the assumptions of how society is run and what we value, and we come out of it with something different. So I don't know how it's going to play out, but you know, when you see, for instance, Spain say we're going to universal basic income, my feeling is that the nations who do stuff like that will probably come out of it far quicker and far better than ones that try to hang on to the old status quo. So, you know, I don't like to make predictions, even though people call me a futurist, because the history of people making predictions tells you that what people tend to predict is things they find emotionally or financially convenient rather than the actual truth. And generally, futurists are techno-optimists who believe that technology will solve everything. And actually, this problem isn't going to be solved by technology. The problem for a social contract are all about inequality and how we organize ourselves. So how we come out of it depends on how brave we are in asking the right questions. And that's why I think that everybody on this call, every single one of us right now, if we have any position of power, and all of us do, even if it's just the ability to voice an opinion with the people that we know, we need to start asking braver questions. And if 51% of us do that, we might come out of this as a more advanced and collaborative species. And all of our successes as a species have been done eventually by collaboration rather than competition, to be honest. So I don't know how it's going to play out, but I think, you know, the answer is, the answer to the question is indeed the question itself, which is, you know, what are you going to do? I mean, Gandhi said it very well, said, be the change you want to see in the world. So if you believe in a better world, believe in a better world. And then when you go back to work, start to question things like the fact that 85% of your employees are not engaged, the fact that a disproportionate amount of the earnings go to, you know, shareholders and the 1%, that our healthcare systems have no spare capacity, that the most important workers we found out are the ones who are the poorest paid, who now have to go and put themselves at risk again and be paid nothing to keep us all alive, while people in expensive consulting jobs have the terror of having to work at home. So we really need to start questioning where things are. And if we can do that, and we can do that with generosity and kindness, then I think there's a lot of good to come out of it.
I mean, it's interesting looking at the sort of what's happening in response to this. There seems to be a number of things that are going on. Some parts of the world looking at sort of almost totalitarian surveillance. Some are looking at citizen empowerment. Some nations are looking at sort of increased sort of isolated nationalism. Others are looking at global solidarity. A question come in from Harry Harrison. saying great points, especially regarding the move away from politicized systems. He says, however, the United States appears to be becoming more polarized. How do you see that situation in the US playing out?
Well, I see it playing out very badly. I mean, my friend Gillespie, Ed Gillespie, calls this moment the great humbling of the predominant Western narrative. I mean, if you look at the way their healthcare system is structured in particular, it's really not very pretty. And you look at the polarization of the politics. And I think it's very interesting, actually, looking at the difference between the way Trump and Boris Johnson have reacted to the crisis. In that Trump, as Harry has kind of pointed out, like American politics, has kind of doubled down on sort of blame and not taking responsibility and trying to make political points. And whether you're a fan or not of Boris Johnson, I think you can see that dawning in his eyes of actually that we all have to be in this together, and there is such a thing as a social contract. And maybe if you come from a left-wing perspective, you may not have thought he's paid that much attention to it, but I think he certainly is now. And the warmness, for instance, about him being in hospital and people talking on the Jeremy Vine show today, Labour politicians going, well, he's a father and he's a colleague, and we all want him to be okay, and that's genuine. And I think so. Nations who can suddenly rediscover that will do better. And I think America, because it's so divided, I don't think it's going to play out very well. I'd like to be wrong. I'd really like to be wrong on that, but I don't think this is going to be America's finest moment.
Well, let's hope you were wrong. I mean, if we look what's happening at the moment, I mean, with remote working, the fact that all of us are working here and tuning in from home learning with our kids, changing the balance of how we manage family life and self-care and community. Do you think that some of these things will lead to a positive shift? Do you think we'll carry some of these over into our everyday life?
I mean, I think it depends on where you're starting from. So I think for some people, this is going to be an absolute nightmare. If you're stuck in an abusive relationship and you can't get out, if you've got 3 kids and you're in a 1-bedroom flat with no outside space, the mental health, just getting to the end of it will be all you can do. Okay. And so this idea that everybody's going to come out sort of feeling brilliant, some people are just going to come out completely shell-shocked, and the effects will be catastrophic for them for years to come. And again, unfortunately, it's the weakest in society that will probably be visited the most pain. But if some of the more privileged people can become a bit more enlightened about some of that stuff. The thing that's different, I think, about the 2008 crisis, I was talking about this the other day with Jeremy Oppenheimer, who runs Systemic. And we were talking about how, we had an opportunity to rebuild the world in 2008, and yet we ended up with a financial system that was even more leveraged at the end of it than the one that collapsed in the first place. And why did we squander that? Well, because, the status quo is very well funded, and as Upton Sinclair says very brilliantly in one of his novels, it's very difficult to get somebody to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. This, I think, is different because it doesn't matter whether you're a hedge fund manager or a checkout cashier. This is affecting everybody in a way that you can actually feel, in that people's relatives are in danger. And as we've seen, whether you're the Prime Minister or even, the Prince of Wales, it's coming for you or somebody close to you. And I always like to say that the brain does the PR of what the heart has already decided. So when the heart feels something, the brain will move. Now, in a way, for the people who were pulling the strings in 2008, that was an intellectual crisis, and they got bailed out by the government. This is no longer an intellectual crisis. This is the crisis of the heart and the soul. And therefore, I think that gives us a great opportunity.
And it seems to, it has and will affect far more people. I mean, to some extent, with the banking collapse, it did affect, people in the UK, for example, the results of austerity and so forth. But the immediate effects of the banking collapse were not as obvious as what's happening now. I mean, both now because our children are out of school, we're in a semi-lockdown situation in the UK at the moment. But this is going to have a prolonged impact as at some point we return. Of course, we'll get past the actual health crisis, but it will leave us with something new. I've got a question here from Dubai, from Reem. How do you think the best way to recover from the pandemic economy impacts, and where would you think the challenge is? So I think the question is, again, understandably, it's about the economy. We had an economy in 2019, and one could argue that economy, the last time there was a major shift in the economy was after the Second World War and the Marshall Plan, and there was a sort of structural reform that gave us the sort of free market economy that we have today. And you could argue that could lead to climate change, environmental damage, and perhaps the environmental conditions for a pandemic to thrive. What can we do now? How can that economy change, or how can we fix the impact this pandemic has had?
Well, I think we need to ask ourselves a different question about what an economy is for. I mean, you talk about the Marshall Plan, but also the National Health Service and the welfare state was born out of the Second World War as well. And actually Churchill was planning that before the end of the Second War, saying, what are we going to be doing afterwards? So, I mean, he didn't plan all of it, obviously, but, that we were already thinking of it. So the way we get out of this is by not going back to where we were before. We have to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. So like the FT leader this week saying, if we started to see investments in social cohesion and public health, for instance, and healthcare services as investments rather than some terrible burden on the taxpayer, then we'd all be in a much better state to have an economy. The economy runs on this operating system, which is, you cannot run for profit. If you want spare capacity in your health service, you're not going to run it along the same line. So we need to ask ourselves some different questions. So the way we get out of this is not by saying, how do we get back to where we were? It's by saying, which assumptions of the way we used to run the world have been proven to be false, of which there are many. Okay, if they are no longer true, what questions do we need to ask ourselves to build a new economy? This is the way that one of the techniques used in my clients is going to list all the assumptions of your business. Then let's go and find which ones aren't true. And then let's go and build your business around, the things that are actually true rather than the things that you assume to be true. And because your competitors won't be doing that because they'll be operating under their own assumptions. They are old assumptions. Now, some nations are going to get this, as my friend Wanarika says, there'll be whole nations are going to end up on the scrap heap because they don't get this done. Some nations are going to ask themselves the right questions and try to answer those. And I'm not suggesting that the world's going to sort of become this wonderful panacea after this pandemic, or it's all going to be brilliant. We're going to have some kind of, paradise where everybody is well looked after. The question is to try and get it better than it was and get it on balance, better for more people than worse. And at the moment, if you look at the world, it is on balance, not very good for most people. When you think about the number who don't even have a toilet or running water or access to electricity or education, and the fact that we're busting through all the planetary boundaries, whether that's soil erosion or phosphorus in the oceans or climate change.
So I mean, the status quo then wasn't really, it was suiting a lot of people, perhaps maybe 2 billion people, but 5 billion people it wasn't, as you sort of pointed out. But isn't it a challenge when you're wanting the sort of structural change if you've benefited from the status quo, you have no motivation to change it? Yeah. And clearly, those that have benefited from each of the structures, whether it's media, education, the political system, and so forth. I mean, there are people that either consciously or unconsciously don't want change to occur or don't see the need to change, even in spite of. Because let's face it, 2019 was a year of many warnings. Australia was on fire. We had one of the warmest years, the second warmest year in record, the warmest decade ever. The highest amount of flooding incidents in America. I mean, that was just 2019. So we had a lot of warnings that we had to change, and yet we haven't. Why with this one?
Because I think people feel this one in a way they don't feel the other, because it affects everybody. And it's really interesting that I was talking to my wife about this last night. She said, I don't think I've ever been in an experience where everybody you look at on the street, everybody you talk to, whether it's somebody you know well or somebody you're having an online conversation with for work or whatever, is kind of in the same boat, is kind of thinking some of the same things. There is this shared experience. And she said that the only thing I can possibly imagine that might have been like that is where if you were in a country that was at war, or the Second World War, something that was global like that. So I think that the reason this is different is because when I do change, I think there's always two things you need to make a change happen. One is you need to change the money, change the way the money feels and thinks. That's why I spend a lot of my time working with investment banks and private banks and asset management houses and all that kind of stuff, because you need to change the way that thinks, as you rightly point out. But part of the way that change happens is you have cultural shifts, whereas people start to to say, this is no longer acceptable. We no longer want this. And I think what COVID is going to do is it's going to accelerate that cultural shift quite strongly. And it's going to do such damage to some of the money that it's going to have to rethink itself anyway. So it's kind of it's possible that we have to turn both of those gears in the right way. But to your point, it's also possible that we could turn those gears completely in the wrong way. And so that's, I guess, why you do the job you do, Graham, and I do the job I do. We're basically trying to get the gears to go, somewhere, or most of the time, at a reasonable speed in the right direction, so that more people have a more, palatable and respectful life.
So another question from Christian Worcester. What role should and could the insurance sector play in the world after COVID-19?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you, Christian, because it's all their fault.
Explain.
So I was asked before the crisis broke to go and address all the CEOs of the world's insurance and reinsurance companies. And I've also been doing a bit of work consultancy with a couple of big insurance companies, so I won't name out of courtesy. And my message to them was, look, when it comes to things like climate change and the breaking down of the social contract and mass inequality and employment disengagement, and these are all massive systemic risks, and leverage in the financial system or whatever. These are all massive systemic risks. And your job as an insurance industry is to price risk and then sell me insurance against it. Okay. But it strikes, so if any industry in the world that should have been way ahead of the game on things like climate change, it should have been insurance and reinsurance industries. But no, they think, no, we will sell you flood risk over here, but we'll also insure a coal-fired power plant over here. Okay. So a complete failure of systemic understanding, and the insurance industry needs to wake the fuck up and start to think in systems rather than in sales channels, because they've been selling risk over here at one price, which makes absolutely no sense given what they are also selling from their own company at that price over there. And if they don't get that sorted, then, for instance, you go to an insurance company and say, how many of you are carbon neutral? And only a few of them will put their hand up. Swiss Re is one, for instance, who I have a lot of time for. And say, well, how can you consider yourself to be an insurance company when you're contributing to the destruction of the environment? That you're not an insurance company, you're a Ponzi scheme. So what does insurance need to do? Insurance needs to ask itself some of the right bloody questions. If we are supposed to be insurance companies, then we need to price risk honestly rather than what we think we can get away with so that we can have short-term profit. Because what the insurance industry has been doing, along with a bunch of other companies, is turning environmental and social degradation into short-term profit at the expense of their children's future.
Good answer. Another question here from Mel Shah. Prior to COVID breaking, there were clear signs of this decade of more being the era of Easternization. The pandemic seems to have accelerated this west to east shift. Do you agree? And how can the East better build this new reimagined future? And what should be the first foundation laying step?
Well, I mean, this goes back, way before, we think about the economies of the East. It goes back to different ways of thinking about philosophy and the way you question things. And if you look at sort of, Chinese and Asian traditions of philosophy, they're very much more generational, much more long-term in thinking. And my favorite Chinese proverb, I think it was Confucius, he said, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is now. And I think the Asian economies have been planting some pretty good trees for a long time. You look at the way, for instance, the Singapore Health Service has dealt with stuff. So I think what we all need to do is listen to each other a bit. The problem with I think all of us at the moment is we're all seeing ourselves in competition with each other, as if somehow the Asian economies are going to beat the Western economies, or the Western economies are going to fight back against China, or whatever, or Europe needs to, surely if nothing else, this pandemic shows us that it's pointless us competing. We should collaborate. We should really be getting rid of all sorts of things that force us to compete at the expense of ourselves and our futures. And I think actually a lot of Asian philosophy, if you look at the great sort of Eastern traditions of philosophy, has more of that in its root than Western philosophy. And I think that's the one thing they can highlight, which has actually come you know, rather than, you know, with our arm outstretched in the hand of friendship, and we can do the same and go, you know, sod all this. We are.
And that's sort of the nature of our economy, though, isn't it? I mean, it's you know, one way of describing what economics is it's a sort of study of how we manage scarcity.
Yeah.
And isn't competition come out of scarcity? I mean, we have a fossil fuel-based economy at the moment, a sort of an extractive economy. And you mentioned earlier, you were talking about, you mentioned a shift to a regenerative economy. Might that help? Could we move from a scarcity-based economy as we are in now to a post-scarcity economy, or is that just naive idealism?
No, I mean, you know, so when I wrote my first book, Optimus Store of the Future, I came to the conclusion at the end of that book. I said, what's really interesting to me, having been around, you know, and spoke to all these amazing scientists and thinkers and philosophers and economists, is that we have all the resources, or all the skill, all the talent, all the philosophies we need to have a perfectly equitable, sustainable, generous world for 11 billion people. Okay, easily sustainable on this planet. There's nothing in the law of thermodynamics that says that can't. What's wrong is the way that we organize ourselves and the way we protect particular ways of doing things that are extractive, you know, this tragedy of the commons. So again, the COVID thing kind of says, if we're all in this together, maybe we could start thinking about how we do agriculture better, how we do our supply chains better, how we do our financial transactions better and more honestly and more transparently. We could, I mean, you know, it's not that we live on a world with finite resources. The sun keeps giving us, you know, almost infinite resource every day. And this been, you know, it's waving a massive energy and prosperity paycheck in our faces every single day, the sun. And what we haven't done is been able to bank it. So we've been running into the savings account, which is fossilized sunshine, which is fossil fuels, at the expense of the environment. And the people who have access to some of those things, you know, don't want other people to have access to them. So yes, I think there is a perfect opportunity. And people have known that for years. It's just, as you say, back to your point again, Graham, some people are very well catered for by keeping the existing system going. And again, this is why I think this current crisis is interesting, because all of a sudden, those people are us and we are them, and we are all starting to have to reevaluate our collective future as a species, not as competing nations.
Well, Mark, I think on that note, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of your questions, but we were limited on time this afternoon. I'm going to applaud you in a silent internet environment. Well done. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to everybody who took up some of their afternoon to join us. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to welcoming you to the next online talk by the London Speaker Bureau, which I'm sure won't be long. Thank you very much, and goodbye. Thank you.